Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this post-Trump, post-traumatic episode of the Zero Hour. Joining us now is our good friend Alex Lawson. Alex is the co-founder of We Act Radio, right here where our brand new studio presents itself, as well as executive director of Social Security Works. And we are here now to talk, as we have said before, and as we now know more than ever, if we're going to have a political revolution in this country, we're going to need a media revolution, because we did not get the facts leading up to this election, and we're going to need them more than ever when President Trump takes office. So here to talk about that is Alex Lawson. Alex, first of all, how are you holding up in this post-Trump environment?
Well, thanks for having me. It's hard, you know. I think everyone should be okay with admitting that it is a very difficult place to be right now. I find some solace. I actually was, first of all, sleep deprived yesterday. And then, though, I actually found some solace in the church that I attend, All Souls Unitarian here, and our long history of organized resistance that that in the scope of history, bad stuff happens quite often, and it is during those times of trial that people of conscience are needed more than ever. And I think that plays into why it's so important that we do have this studio here in Anacostia, why we built this studio. My business partner, Kimon Freeman, and I, as you know, have a saying that until the lions have their own storytellers, the story will always glorify the hunt. And so we're trying to build a place where the lions can tell our own stories. And as you said, now more than ever, it's going to be important that people can find information that they can trust, that we can tell our own stories. The corporate media, I believe, there's many factors, but the corporate media is one of the largest factors that led us here, not only in empowering Donald Trump by just giving him millions of dollars, but also by completely icing out Bernie Sanders during the primary and just not covering him at all. And that's just a choice they made, right?
Right. I mean, Bernie Sanders' rise should have been the political story of the decade. It was so transformational. He came out of nowhere. He was drawing 30,000 people at a time. But they focused on Donald Trump instead. And not once, but more than once, Les Moonves, the president of CBS, literally said, Trump may not be good for the country, but he's good for CBS. That is the cold, cunning calculation that we're up against in the corporate media. And to me, that's one of the many reasons why we need an alternative.
I agree. I also, you know, like I said, finding solace and hope, and I am an optimist. I'm very optimistic about our future. I had a clearer vision for how we were going to get there before, you know, whatever, 12:30 a.m. on Wednesday. But in the long arc, as long as people of conscience can stand up and stand together, all power does emanate from the people. And I have a fundamental belief in our country, in the United States of America, that when we stand together, we are really unstoppable and we can achieve great things. Unfortunately, we can also achieve terrible things.
Right, you know, that's right. And you mentioned, by the way, that the notion of hope and faith and the will to go on. I would say Rebecca Solnit, the writer, who created, by the way, the term mansplaining. She wrote an essay called "Men Explain Things to Me," where she talks about how somebody was very carefully explaining to her what the writer meant in a certain article that she had actually written. And that's where the term comes from. But she wrote a book called A Paradise Built in Hell. And the whole premise of the book is that when people are in terrible circumstances, she wrote about Bhopal, 9/11, a couple other events, tragedies, that when people are in catastrophic circumstances, what gets them through and sustains them, they actually sometimes get more of a sense of purpose and satisfaction because they build communities working toward a common purpose. And I think part of what I get from what you're saying is that in this electronic age, something like this studio, this kind of means of communication among people, for people, can be that kind of community that brings us together and gives us hope and strength.
I think that's exactly right. I don't. My optimism has to be based on a true understanding that there are terrible things that people continue to do, can do, that our nation has done. But in remembering those things, it's also important to remember that the history of organized resistance. And I think that this is something that the corporate media and basically the power structure tries to ice out of the story as much as possible, right? So, like, if you think about the abolition of slavery and the story that's told, it like stuff happened and then there's a civil war, or slavery was happening and then there was a civil war, and then after the Civil War, slavery was abolished. And you're like, that's not even a small part of the story. There was organized resistance amongst enslaved people, amongst free people in America, in Britain, a global movement of organized resistance that failed for hundreds of years. And in fact, in 1776, there was a huge movement of abolition in America, that if this new nation was going to be founded on freedom and justice and liberty, it had to be liberty for everybody. And it seemed, there was a like, oh, we're going to win, and then no.
Right.
And then it took a long time, right? 100, and I can't do the math off the top of my head, but through that entire time, there were people of good faith standing together and resisting this system of violence. And I think you have to have an understanding that organized resistance is critical, that actually and rarely gets written up, rarely gets to be told in the story, but is fundamentally it's how we actually accomplish things. We usually see the things when they happen, but we just kind of miss the whole story that led up to it. So shows like yours and why we have We Act Radio is so that people can tell the story of us actually coming together to accomplish things.
And it makes me think of the fact that there was a time when I think our schools talked more about the 19th century, for example. The fact that what organized movements in the 19th and 20th century did for voting rights, for unionization, for fighting the robber barons of the Gilded Age, that we've had tough fights before. This is not the first time. And I really appreciate your comments about how many setbacks and defeats you have before you finally make it. I probably shouldn't quote Mao Zedong, but a revolution is not a dinner party. That you're going to lose. But those losses can turn into inspirational records for the future, as far as I'm concerned. That there were a group of young women working in factories in Massachusetts who decided on their own. They invented something called a union, and they got together and they unionized and they fought against their conditions, and they lived communally, and they put out a newspaper. They did all these fantastic things, and then they were defeated and they were gone. Except that they planted the seed for an idea that transformed the entire world. So, and of course, it was being planted elsewhere as well. But there's no reason to think you lost just because you've had a setback, right?
Exactly. Actually, we watched the same speech where John Nichols talked about Eugene Debs, and he ran as a socialist for president, and he lost. And then he ran for president as a socialist again, and he lost. And those are losses that he faced. But he fought for ideas, many of which were implemented a couple decades later as part of the New Deal. So when you're fighting for justice, when you're fighting for people on the side of people power, it is important to recognize that there will always be an ebb and a flow. And it's also it's important to remember how profoundly huge money power is, right? Like, it shouldn't surprise us that money power. I don't know if you saw the news that Donald Trump is now talking about Jamie Dimon as a possible Treasury Secretary,
the
right?
CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the most serially criminal organizations in the world, I would argue, yeah.
So like that's the opposition, right? They have so much money, and we won't always win. But we will only lose when we stop fighting, and that's the thing that I hope people remember. And it's what I hope with We Act Radio. What we're able to do is it's easier to keep heart, to keep faith, to keep fighting when you really know that you're not alone. When you can find that community of people who are also fighting and continuing to fight for justice.
Absolutely. And the other night, by the way, here, and I should mention, we were in Anacostia, a great part of Washington, D.C., that is fighting to preserve its own nature as a community. And the other night, at a get-together here, I met a therapist who has a radio program on this show and asked her to be on this show because I thought we could all use a little therapy after the Trump victory. I think that also, let's talk a little bit about the specifics then. Okay, so we've got a new studio here, which by the way is, I'm always uncomfortable doing like boosterism, but this is great. This is a great television studio here east of the Anacostia River.
The first television studio east of the river.
Okay, and that's important because east of the river is not your institutional Washington, D.C. that most people think of.
It's actually oftentimes, not oftentimes, but sometimes when there are gatherings in D.C., they will send notes to people saying, don't go to certain parts of Washington, D.C., and usually circling the east bank of the Anacostia. It is a forgotten part of D.C., D.C. being oftentimes forgotten by the rest of the nation. We don't have a vote. We don't have any representation in Congress. We're used as a little political punching bag often. And even within D.C., east of the river is the forgotten side of D.C., especially when it comes to accountability and political power. And that's why Kimona and I, it actually doesn't make much sense, our little studio here. You know that.
Right.
It doesn't make that much sense. This is built right on the road. We got a storefront studio. It actually looks very much like Do the Right Thing, the storefront studio in the movie.
It does, actually. You're right.
But that, and that's We Love Radio, but it doesn't make that much sense to have a storefront studio because there's cars that drive by and all of that. But we really think it's important that we are not the glass enclosed nerve center in the middle of a nondescript office building in Northwest DC. We're right here on the street in Anacostia, telling the people's story and raising the people's voices. And now 5 years later, and it's been a battle, as you know, you've been part of it. We completed this TV studio, which, you know, I don't have as much of a problem engaging in boosterism, but even even I am impressed with this in a very real way. What we've built here is amazing.
Yeah, no, I really think so too. And by the way, when you talk about the neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. and so on, just to be specific, when I was still using Uber, which I've dropped for political reasons, it's the kind of neighborhood that when you punch it into your Uber request, sometimes drivers cancel on you.
Before Uber, it was impossible to get a cab here.
Yeah.
When the cab system in DC used to be just absolutely terrible. They would not drive here. I organized east of the river for many years. That's how Kimona and I know each other. It would take
Timon Freeman, your co-owner,
my business partner. We would organize east of the river, and it would take me like 5 cabs to get right. They'd stop, and I'd be like, I'm going to Anacostia, and they'd be like, oh, I'm on call, and then they drive off. Now on the council and We Act Radio, this building, our endeavor here is seen as very important in the fact that people have a voice, that the politicians actually know that we're out here telling stories of people from the community here in Anacostia. And a lot of people, I don't want to spend, I know we're running out of time. We have 2 parts of We Act Radio. We have a series of shows called Livewire where we work to train during our summer program. We train youth, high school students from the area, and we have a bunch of local shows talking about local DC issues. not all local. Sometimes they talk about national. Some of our shows talk about national. And then we have kind of the other side is national progressive politics. And we are always trying to marry the two of them because telling the story of Washington, D.C. is important. So I'm just excited. We've accomplished a lot with a radio station, and I'm really excited to see what we can accomplish with a television station.
Well, that's a great way to put it, and I'll just conclude by saying that if we want to build a virtual community using television and radio, which we are doing now and have already been doing, I always think it's good to be grounded in a physical community as well. And I really feel when I come here to do the show, and I go to the corner store or I walk the street here, I really feel part of this community now, and I think so. I'm glad that we act as representing this community. I'm proud to be part of it, and glad you came on the show, Alex Lawson.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, as we say, broadcasting from the heart of Anacostia, straight to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., and we will be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour.